Cinerama was pretty much the IMAX of its day from 1952 on to about actually 1970, something in a different form. And for people in the 50s who did not travel, did not go anywhere, stayed in their own hometowns, that sort of thing, going to a nearby larger city where these Cinerama theaters were, because they had required special equipment, was a family outing generally. And people would travel 100 miles from one city to another in America to see these Cinerama shows and to sort of do a very experiential looking at their world they live in. And it created a huge boom in travel because finally people would start to save up for a trip because they saw it in Cinerama. And the first Cinerama movie ever made was the #1 box office hit of the year, 1952, only in 1 or 2 theaters. Imagine 1 or 2 theaters being the biggest box office hit. The last movie filmed in the actual old Cinerama process was the #1 hit of the year, 1962. So overall it lasted about 14 years of popularity, to the point where the word Cinerama, at least in America and England and Australia, was a household word. To a certain extent, Cinerama can serve as a lesson for modern cinematographers, mostly for what not to do. Because when you work in Cinerama, it's such a super wide-angle, horizontal medium that you have almost like, and it's 3 pieces of film, 3 separate lenses. You have the problem of always worrying about sun flares, constantly. Almost any place you set the camera, you're going to get a sun flare. So you have to have a tree branch handy in the grip truck. You have to have all kinds of stuff to and so therefore you can't move the camera a lot, because you move it over here, the sun's going to hit it, and there goes one panel, it becomes a foggy, sun-streaked panel. So it was part of the reason why Cinerama is no longer with us, is because it was so hard to work with, and cinematographers would have to go through like orientation, not like they would on a normal camera, but even worse with Cinerama because they were so restricted. You could not change lenses. There was no such thing as a zoom. If you wanted to move the camera, which was close to 300 some pounds, you had to put it on a special dolly and move the camera closer to the actors. The actors had to revolve around the camera, and they couldn't stand between the 2 divide lines, or it would be right in there, be awkward. So hitting your marks as an actor in camera was much more complicated, and certainly shooting with it was much more complicated. And every one of the cameramen were ASC cameramen, and they would write articles in the American Cinematographer magazine about how difficult this was. So if anything, it was a good experience for a cameraman to work in this format. And then when he went to work in normal films, it was like freedom. It was like, now they can really be creative. But the opposite of that is Cinerama was so different for audiences that they got much more out of it than you would think, because it was very participatory. You felt like you were in the movie. It had a 3-dimensional feel without glasses. It had a lot of advantages too, but boy, was it hard to work in. Having never restored a regular movie, but I've talked to people who have, to pat myself on the back for a second, it's 3 times as hard. And then it's 4 times as hard, because the 4th dimension of this is you have to take these 3 images and put them together again for the first time in 50 years as one image, because it's 3 separate images. And I was at the Venice International Film Festival about a year ago doing a seminar on digital restoration. And they had just finished restoring several movies that were premiering at the Venice Film Festival. One of them was Heaven's Gate. There were, I think, Sunset Boulevard, a few others. And I kind of said to the audience, I wish I just had 1 frame to restore and not 3 that have to work together as a unit. So from the difficulty, it stems from the fact that you can't take a traditional approach. You have to totally think outside the box and come up with interesting ways to put these images back together again and make them work like they did, which is difficult when they haven't been stored. The film elements, the negatives, have not been stored properly over the years. At studios, they would have special vaults. Sometimes they're air-cooled, all that wonderful stuff. But the Cinerama stuff was in a warehouse. It was hot in the summer. It was cold in the winter. The film would shrink and expand, and the sprocket holes would go funny on you. And so, therefore, one of the big difficulties of Cinerama is with the shrinkage of film. If you have one film that is shrunk and it vibrates a little bit and the pen registration doesn't quite work and everything, you can do some electronic steadying, right, to get the image back to a rock steady image to a certain extent. With Cinerama, you got 3 of them. They've shrunken at different rates. So there's 3 things doing this all over the screen. It's like somebody stirring soup, you know. The difficulty with Cinerama is, of course, the 3 images, as always. But if the film has shrunken at different rates, which it has, and you're putting this back together for the first time in 50 years, this panel would be moving like this, then the middle one, and you have to restudy every one separately, and then you have to restudy them again as they become a 3-paneled unit, 1 frame, so that it's not a vibrating image. And these are very historical images that you'll never capture again, like Las Vegas, 1954, things around the world, people that are doing cultural things. Cinerama would always cover cultural things, a native dance in Africa or something. So this is stuff that's really like what you like to call Cinerama a virtual reality time capsule. I'm an archaeologist. I'm digging in these ancient graves with film. And now I'm trying to put this stuff back together for the first time in 50, 60 years. And so I feel like I've got an archaeologist with a little brush and I'm going across some bones to discover some lost civilization almost, which is a kind of a tough job when you have a wife looking over your shoulder saying, "Why are you doing this?" One of the other things we did in this Cinerama archaeological expedition we've been on the last couple of years is part of the grant money went towards shooting an experiment of restoring the old Cinerama camera from 1954. This particular model was 1954. It was used on all throughout the Cinerama travelogues. We had it restored by Ken Stone of Stone Engineering, who worked on it for 6 months, experimentally trying to figure out what is a whole kind of different type of camera, as you know, with three lenses and 3 magazines and 3 camera bodies behind another one. So part of this was to shoot something with modern film stocks with a fine grain, which they didn't have in the 50s, to see what it looked like on the screen. Well, that was the inspiration. We ended up making a little movie by accident. It was about 24 minutes long, and we shot it like a travelogue from the 1950s. We shot it at the Cinerama frame rate, which is 26 frames per second, not 24, which was a big problem. And we made this little, for lack of a better word, 1950s travelogue with 1950s dialogue, but with modern day people. And it was another experience in cinema forensics, because when you have an old camera this old, how do you figure out how to use it? And the interesting part about that is that we actually found the original camera manuals. A guy had them in his garage in New Hampshire or something, heard we were doing the project on the internet, and sent us the camera manual. So now we can figure out how to use the camera. It was just an amazing historical thing of everything coming together at one time to make something happen. And it was quite an experiment.
Cinerama, first of all, was the thrill of my life. I would have never expected to do that in 100 years. But engaging with David, engaging the camera, engaging with Ken Stone, who repaired the camera, was a real learning experience. And I found that there were actually a lot of similarities between shooting a normal camera and shooting the Cinerama camera. Just 3 times as much work. But the rules apply pretty much. There's a couple of modifications you have to watch. But the equipment, other than being bigger and heavier, works almost the same. And you get these incredible pictures that the 70mm cameras can approach, but Cinerama does it so much better in its own way. It has some limitations, but the end results really are most involving for the audience and very gratifying to work with. The best aspect of doing the project for me was working with a bunch of Cinerama kooks. just absolutely devoted to the process. As David said, we got a Cinerama manual from back east. People from all over. I soon got used to turning around and finding 5 cameras looking at me as we were shooting this. They just relished the process and everything that went into making this new film, the first time in 50 years Cinerama had been shot. The most difficult was the temptation to tilt the camera up or down because you wanted to catch the top of a sailboat, or you wanted to be able to see something that was a little off level. And that's become a real no-no in Cinerama. It does funny things to the horizon. John Hora did point out something very interesting, that you could get a radical angle, something that was very off level, and especially if you're in an area where there are no horizons or no lines that you're worried about distorting, that you can get some really interesting images out of.